That's what happened. You got this text from your bank. Had you had a text from your bank before?
Yes,
Hey there! Are you tired of hearing about big banks getting away with fraudulent behavior?
It's a scam happening all over the country, and it could become a big problem here as well. Account takeover fraud.
You're not alone. In this video, we'll be taking a closer look at how some of the biggest banks in the world have been accused of or convicted of fraud, and how they continue to engage in this unethical behavior despite facing legal consequences. From the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s to the subprime mortgage crisis of the 2000s, these banks have a long history of exploiting their power and influence to benefit themselves at the expense of ordinary people. But don't worry, we'll also be discussing some potential solutions for preventing big bank fraud and holding these institutions accountable for their actions. So sit back, relax, and get ready to learn more about this important and timely topic. Despite facing legal consequences for their actions, big banks continue to engage in fraudulent behavior.
All right, everybody, hands up, heads down!
This is largely due to their immense power and influence, which allows them to shape the regulatory environment in their favor and avoid accountability for their actions. One example of this is the fines and settlements that big banks have been required to pay for engaging in fraudulent behavior. While these penalties may seem large, they often pale in comparison to the profits that these banks have made through their unethical actions. In many cases, these fines are seen as the cost of doing business and do not serve as a strong enough deterrent to prevent future fraudulent behavior. Additionally, big banks often have close relationships with government regulators, which can give them an advantage when it comes to avoiding stricter regulations or enforcement of existing regulations. These relationships, along with the resources and lobbying power of big banks, can make it difficult for regulators to hold them accountable for their actions. Overall, the power and influence of big banks allows them to continue engaging in fraudulent behavior, despite facing legal consequences. It is important for there to be stricter measures in place to hold these institutions accountable and prevent them from exploiting their power for their own benefit. Big bank fraud has a long history, with examples dating back several decades. One notable example is the savings and loan crisis of the 1980s, in which many banks engaged in fraudulent activities such as insider lending and mismanagement of funds. These actions contributed to the failure of hundreds of savings and loan institutions, leading to widespread financial losses for both investors and depositors. Despite facing legal consequences, many of the banks involved in the savings and loan crisis were able to continue operating and even received government bailouts. Some were eventually fined or required to pay settlements, but the penalties were not always significant enough to deter future fraudulent behavior. Another example of big bank fraud is the subprime mortgage crisis of the 2000s, in which big banks were accused of issuing risky mortgages to people who couldn't afford them and then packaging and selling these mortgages as securities to investors. When the housing market crashed and these mortgages defaulted, it led to widespread financial devastation and contributed to the Great Recession. While some banks were fined and required to pay settlements, many argued that the fines were not significant enough to deter future fraudulent behavior. There are a few key ways in which big banks are able to get away with fraud. One is through their immense power and influence, both in the financial industry and in the political sphere. These banks often have close relationships with government regulators, which can give them an advantage when it comes to avoiding stricter regulations or enforcement of existing regulations. Additionally, the resources and lobbying power of big banks can make it difficult for regulators to hold them accountable for their actions. Another factor that contributes to big banks getting away with fraud is the complexity of financial markets. The vast and interconnected nature of these markets makes it difficult for regulators to detect and prove fraudulent activity, giving banks an opportunity to continue engaging in unethical behavior. Finally, big banks often have the resources to hire top lawyers and fight legal battles, making it harder for prosecutors to hold them accountable. This can further discourage regulators from taking action against these institutions, as the cost and effort of pursuing a legal case may not seem worthwhile. Overall, the combination of power, influence, and legal resources makes it easier for big banks to get away with fraud. The impact of big bank fraud on ordinary people can be significant and long-lasting. One way in which big bank fraud can affect ordinary people is through the loss of their homes or retirement savings. For example, during the subprime mortgage crisis of the 2000s, many people lost their homes as a result of banks issuing risky mortgages that they couldn't afford. Similarly, the fraud and mismanagement that led to the failure of savings and loan institutions in the 1980s resulted in the loss of millions of dollars in depositors' savings. Another impact of big bank fraud on ordinary people is the lack of accountability for these institutions. When big banks are able to get away with fraudulent behavior, it can lead to a lack of trust in the financial system as a whole. This can make people hesitant to invest their money or use financial services, which can have broader economic consequences. Overall, big bank fraud has a negative impact on ordinary people through the loss of their homes and savings and can undermine trust in the financial system. It is important for there to be stricter measures in place to prevent and hold these institutions accountable for their actions. There are few potential solutions for preventing big bank fraud. One is increased regulation and oversight of the financial industry.
No, no!
This could include stricter rules and regulations to prevent fraudulent behavior, as well as more frequent and thorough audits and investigations to ensure that these rules are being followed. Another solution is tougher penalties for banks that engage in fraudulent behavior. This could include higher fines or longer prison sentences for individuals within the bank who are found to be responsible for fraudulent activities. A third solution is greater accountability for individual executives within banks who may be responsible for fraudulent activities. This could involve holding these executives personally responsible for their actions, rather than allowing the bank as a whole to pay a fine or settlement. Overall, implementing stricter measures to prevent and punish big bank fraud can help to hold these institutions accountable for their actions and protect ordinary people from the negative consequences of fraud. Big banks have a long history of committing fraud and facing legal consequences for their actions. Despite this, they continue to engage in fraudulent behavior, largely due to their immense power and influence. The complexity of financial markets and the resources of big banks also make it difficult for regulators to detect and prove fraud, allowing these institutions to get away with unethical behavior. To prevent big banks from committing fraud, there is a need for stricter measures such as increased regulation and oversight of the financial industry, tougher penalties for banks that engage in fraudulent behavior, and greater accountability for individual executives within banks.